Before I invite counsel to the inquiry to lead, who is, I think, our only witness for today, can I take the opportunity to announce my decision in relation to the applications which I heard at 9 o'clock? I propose to grant the restriction order, or strictly speaking, impose the restrictions as a provided or as sought in the Scottish Minister's application, which came to be the restrictions which were sought in the Greater Glasgow Health Board application. So what is sought is granted. The reasons for that, I hope, will be available later in the week. But with that, I invite counsel to begin.
Yes, good morning, my lord. We have one witness today. That is Molly Cuddihy, witness room.
Thank you. Yes. Good morning, Ms. Cuddihy.
Yeah.
Now, as you appreciate, you're about to be asked questions by Mr. Duncan, who I think you've had the opportunity of meeting.
Yeah.
Right. Before you do that, can I just make clear that if you want to take a break at any time, for any reason, either a short break or a longer break, just say so, and we'll do that. We're now at about 10:30. I would anticipate taking a coffee break 11:30, 11:45, largely as and when Mr. Duncan thinks we've come to a sort of natural break in the evidence. So we'll do that anyway. But as I say, if there's any stage that you want to, take a break for any reason, we'll do that. Now,
Thank you.
Are you happy to take the oath?
Yes.
Can I ask you, just sitting where you are, to raise your right hand and repeat these words after me? I swear by Almighty God.
Swear by Almighty God.
That I will tell the truth.
That I will tell the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Now, the microphone, I have to confess, I'm hard of hearing, which is a polite way of saying a bit deaf. I think the microphone will help, and the system, I think, kicks in after a moment or two. But maybe just speaking a little louder than you would in normal conversation. Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, my lord. Can I just say I'm hard of speaking and I have problems with the microphones as well, so we may get you to sort of sugar it about if I can't hear you. Good morning again.
Morning.
We usually start with some formal questions, and if I could do that just now, could I just have you confirm that you are Molly Cuddihy?
Yep.
And for this morning's and indeed this afternoon's purposes, you want me to call you Miss Cuddihy or Molly?
Molly's fine.
You're 19 years old?
Yep.
And you live in the west of Scotland with your mum and dad and your brother, is that right?
I do, yes.
And you're a student?
I am.
Where are you a student?
University of Glasgow.
Studying?
Physiology.
In which year?
Second year.
Now, you've provided us with a detailed witness statement of your experiences at the Royal Hospital for Children and the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital in Glasgow. And are we right in understanding that you're content that that forms part of your evidence to the hospital inquiry?
Yes, I am.
You've agreed to come along today and answer some more questions about that, is that right?
Yes.
Now, am I also right in understanding that you've got a copy of your statement beside you?
I do, yes.
Now, we're not going to be walking through it in detail. I will go to bits of it. If you want to go to it at any point to refresh your memory, just do that. But I emphasise to you, as I said to you before, this isn't I'm not here to test you on what happened on particular dates, so don't worry too much about that. Let's start with some background. Something again that we usually do. We usually start in particular about finding out about the person, giving out evidence. And the reason for that is because although this inquiry is a story of a hospital in Glasgow and a story of a hospital in Edinburgh, it's principally a story of people. So, can we go back to December 2017? And can you introduce us to the Molly Cuddihy that we would have met then?
Yes, so I was in 4th year of school. I was getting ready to sit my National 5 prelims. Since I was a small kid, I've really wanted to study medicine. So, as you can imagine, it was my entire life was books and studying. I didn't really have much of a life outside of that. But I love music. I've played the piano since I was 3. At that point, I like to think that I was teaching myself the guitar, and I sing a bit. But yeah, just pretty much studying.
I mean, was music quite a big part of
Yeah.
the time that you weren't looking at books?
Yes, that was my relax. Playing piano was always my relax. Yeah, enjoyed that, and a lot of my friends are involved in kind of the same music, and a lot of them all play instruments. So that would be a nice break.
And what music would that be?
I listen to a variety, to be honest. My favourite's Paolo Nutini, without a doubt. But I love a lot of bands, like The Killers and Arctic Monkeys and Sam Fender and things. So.
And did I detect from your statement that you've done a few gigs over the years?
Yeah. That's my friends and I. That tends to be our nights out.
So what would be, if we were to ask you, what's the standout gig for you?
Recently, just there, I was at Transmit and I saw Sam Fender. I didn't have a chance to see him while I was sick, and a lot of my friends all did. So that was really nice. That was special, I'd say, more than anything.
Okay, now I'm going to start the story in a minute, but before we do, I want to ask another question about Molly Cuddihy as a person, and just something I want you to help us think about. I mean, what sort of person do you describe yourself as?
I tend to be very organised. I'm very particular about things in the sense that I've always had this drive to do what I want to do beyond school, and it's always kind of everything's been stepping stones because of that. And so, as much as I've got everything I enjoy, I'm always very organised in that sense. And I tend to take that approach with a lot of things, particularly how I feel about things. I tend to shut things off and put it in boxes. That's the way I tend to cope with a lot of things, a lot of stress. And I'd probably say in particular with things like this that I'm quite good at detaching myself from my feelings in order to cope with things and perhaps deal with them later on. Probably compartmentalising feelings. And I'd say that's probably one of my concerns, that at times I feel like I'm across as quite cold because of that, because I can detach myself from my feelings, so it might look as if I'm not bothered by things. I'm not upset, like this, for instance. It might look as if it doesn't upset me because I can put on a smile and I can get on with it, but it's just my way of coping. It's just putting it in a box in order to get through it and to talk about it and get it over with.
I mean, quite a lot in that answer. I'm going to ask you some more about it. You're somebody who likes a plan.
Yeah, 100%. That's always been kind of my life has been planned, and so you can imagine that a cancer diagnosis thrown into that as a teenager was not according to plan, and threw everything out.
And we'll go through other jolts along the road that led to changes of plans, is that right?
Yeah.
What's your plan for today?
I just kind of tell my story.
And just thinking about what you just said, though, about being a bit detached. Do you find that you're somebody who's able to analyse information and process it? And is that what you've done in providing that statement?
Yes, definitely. And it was similar throughout my treatment as well. I can look at information and assess information in order to make a decision and then deal with the consequences later, kind of thing.
And so what is it that you're concerned is maybe absent? That
Sorry.
in describing it in that analytical way, what is it that you're concerned?
That I seem as if it doesn't bother me. It can come across as if I'm a bit blasé about it, and I'm not at all. It does bother me, but I'd prefer to deal with it myself. It's just the way I've always been.
Okay, well let's begin the story then. Let's begin with the events leading up to the 16th of January 2018. You'd be working towards your Nat 5s, is that right?
Yeah.
And I think we can see from your statement that there was a spell towards the end of 2017 where you weren't feeling that great, is that right?
No, I was going downhill.
Yeah. Well, why don't you take us from there? Take us from there to the events at the Inverclyde Royal Hospital on the 16th of January 2018. Walk us through that.
Okay. So for a couple of months leading up to December, I was back and forward to GPs. I had a number of symptoms. I was losing weight. I was coughs and colds and cold sores and things. They just wouldn't go away, and it was thought maybe I had different infections or kidney infections. I had a large mass on my side, and it just seemed to be getting bigger. By the time I got to December, it was huge. My whole hand, I couldn't hold it, but there was a lot of pain associated with it. And it kind of, eventually I went to see a GP that was a family friend in the January, and I hadn't been able to get an appointment with him prior to this. And everyone else I saw, because of my age and because I was a girl, it was assumed that there was a number of different things it could be, and no one's ever going to assume that it's cancer. But I saw Dr. Barron. He's known me since I was a child, and I've never been one for needing to go to the doctors. I was never off school. Even if I had a cold, it was away in a day kind of thing. But it just didn't add up for him that I wasn't recovering, and that this mass on my side. Now, we didn't for 1 minute imagine that it was what it was, but I saw him on the Friday and he sent me for a scan for the Tuesday at Inverclyde Royal Hospital. So on the Tuesday, the 16th of January, and I believe it was 8:30 in the morning, so it was a bit of a disaster the way I was dressed. It was like a hoodie and leggings. I just had no expectation that it was going to be anything other than a routine scan. But I went in myself, and that was the first time I've gone into an appointment myself without my mum, and I was a bit grown up. But the ultrasound, the lady that was doing it, could tell she was starting to get a bit uncomfortable, and then she started asking me how my breathing was and what kind of pain I was having, and then she excused herself and went and got the lead consultant, and he came in and he had a look himself, and he was just asking me similar questions, and then he told me that something unusual was on the scan, and that they wanted to put me into A&E in Inverclyde, so that they could put me in for a CT. That was the only way that they could register me for that day for a CT. So I was logged as a patient. My mum and I went along. I think at that point, I had done a lot of reading. Like I said, I like information, and I kind of researched all my symptoms, and of course that's one of the things that comes up when you look up masses and lumps. But it was always kind of in the back of my head. And so when they kind of started to panic, then I was a bit worried. So I had my CT, and then the A&E doctor came and spoke to my mum and I, and she took us to a side room, and they brought in a nurse as well. And she had actually worked in Schiehallion. She came in and told me that she believed I had a sarcoma, and I needed to leave right away and go straight to Schiehallion. Because we couldn't believe at first that I had to go straight away. We thought they would maybe just send us to an appointment. But no, I had to head up that day. I didn't really have time. So I was sent straight up, and I went to 2B daycare, and I met Dr. Sastry and Dr. Sassy, and they did different checks. They took my bloods. The nurses took my bloods. They put me in for different tests, and I was set as an inpatient that night.
Okay. What age were you?
15.
So you've taken us to your first night at the Royal Hospital Children. When did you get confirmation of diagnosis?
So I was told right away that it was a sarcoma. That's what they believed it was. But the next day I went for a full body MRI, and then I was also set to the Dr. Sastry told me at that point, when they saw the results of that he believed it was malignant, but they would obviously do the biopsy just to double check and to be able to know what type of cancer it was. There's a range of different sarcomas it could be, or it could have been something else entirely. So I went in for a biopsy, a double bone marrow aspiration, and that confirmed that it was Ewing's sarcoma, that it was metastatic. So it had not only spread, so it was my 11th rib, and it kind of spread across, so that it was the rib, the 12th year last rib below that, and the one above it, and at my diaphragm, and it spread to my lungs and into my 10th vertebrae in my spine. So I had to start treatment right away. So I was put in for a line that Friday night, and I was allowed home on the Saturday to begin treatment the following week.
Stop there, or pause there. I'm going to, in a minute, start to look in detail at the history of your treatment. So let's just pause. Just help set the scene a wee bit. Imagine I'm a 15-year-old child arriving for the first time in Schiehallion unit. Your job is to give me the guided tour. What would I see? Maybe start with 2B. I think that's where you went first, isn't it? So walk me through it.
So because I was a new diagnosis, and I think because they didn't want to overwhelm me as well, I was taken to one of the private rooms within 2B. So there's 4 private treatment rooms, or I believe 4. Sorry, it's been a couple of years since I've been there. And that's kind of where you would get maybe cannulated, or if you were really poorly and you were taken to daycare, you might go there. Obviously, in my situation, it was just to give me that privacy. So there's also I suppose if you're 15, there's the Teenage Cancer Trust 4-bed bay within 2B, and that was where you would go for kind of bloods, and if you needed a blood transfusion or a platelet transfusion, or if you were getting set up for your chemotherapy. As a teenager, you would always go there. They were the dead comfy chairs, and it was a bit them away from the kids, because they used to get quite upset.
Yeah. So arriving there, is reception in 2B?
Yeah,
Yeah.
there is.
And there's also a waiting room, is that right?
There is, yes.
And I think your statement you described there's toys laid out for
Yeah.
the youngsters, is that
Yeah.
right? And on reception, a particular person that tended to be there.
Yes, Noreen.
Tell us a bit about Noreen.
Everyone loves Noreen. She is one of the kindest people you'll ever meet. She sets up everything for you. She set up all my wigs for me with the Little Princess Trust. That was one of the first things she did for me, because I think with my age and things, she knew it would be something that would bother me. So the first thing she did was contact the Little Princess Trust to organise my wig.
Right.
But she has this pink box she keeps under her desk, and I think it's the fairy box, and the wee ones, when they come up, they can pick a toy. And that's them. They're being good. They've come and they've got their treatment, or they've got their bloods taken, so they can pick a toy from the fairy box off of Noreen. So all the kids absolutely adored her.
Now you mentioned the particular space for the teenagers, and you mentioned the Teenage Cancer Trust. We're going to be speaking a lot about the Teenage Cancer Trust as we go along today. Let's just start with now. Tell us what it is.
So the Teenage Cancer Trust is for ages 13 to 24, but obviously within the kids' hospital, I think the max you can be is 18, and it's basically to provide support for everyone within that age group. They have units within the ward specifically for teenagers, and they fund that, and it's a nicer setup for a teenager and things.
And it's a UK charity, is that right?
Yeah, UK-based charity.
And they provide support and facilities for teenagers and their parents across the UK, is that right?
Yes.
Now take me into Ward 2A. But I'm 15 years old, and I'd be quite keen to see what provision there is in there for me. What is there for me in Ward 2A? So
right up the very top end, away from everyone else, is the Teenage Cancer Trust unit. So it's not sectioned off, but it's away at the very end. So it's separate from where all the younger kids would be. And there's 4 Teenage Cancer Trust specific rooms, and then there's 2 other rooms that the teenagers tended to overflow to. So it was bigger beds in there. And then we have our common room. So the common room is brilliant. There was kind of kitchen facilities. We had a fridge, a freezer. We'd make a tea and a coffee, and there was like a grill and microwave and stuff, which was handy because no one liked hospital food. And there's like these big lazy boy chairs that you can kind of lie right back on. There's the TVs with the PlayStations and the Xboxes or whatever people play. I don't know. And there's a pool table, and there's a table you can sit with people at, and a jukebox and things. It's a brilliant room.
One of the things that you just mentioned there, table, that's something that was quite important to you.
Oh, that was the most important thing to me. I'm not a PlayStation person at all. That I leave that to my brother. But that table kind of provided me. I met some of my closest friends on that ward, and it was there I got to sit with Sarah. I'll probably talk about Sarah later, but Sarah's my best friend, and we met on TCT, and Sarah was really poorly when I met her, really poorly, and really kind of all we could do was sit together. But every day I got to sit there, and I got to do my work as well, but it kind of gave you a lot more than that. I was adamant I was not getting a feeding drip, and I believe I hold the record for the longest going without a feeding tube. But because of that table, I could sit down and actually eat something, which it sounds ridiculous, but even if you're having something like ice cream, it's calories, and it's one step away from that feeding tube, and it puts it off. And it's one less ordeal to go through. I mean, you've got enough tubes, so that was so important for me for that. I could actually sit down with my mum, my dad, and my brother when he was home and eat something as a family. which is really nice. It is kind of the small things like that that you forget that you're going to miss. So that provided a lot, that table.
How long would you say, on average, would you spend a day in there?
All day, yeah. I think just, you stay in your bed all day, then it's almost like it makes you sick. That obviously we're all unwell, but your attitude contributes so much to that. And if you stay in bed all day and you just lie there, you feel sick. And then it's really hard to get out of that once you fall into it. And so kind of getting up every day, and even that short walk along the corridor to get to that room, that's aiding in your mobility. So that was kind of keeping me on my feet more than anything, because you would waste away in bed otherwise. And then I could actually sit and I could do my work, or I could spend all day with Sarah talking. And we did spend all day talking. I don't know how she's not fed up with me. You could sit and have a cup, like we would watch TV. I mean, when Bake Off is on, you forget you can't watch things like that. But it was all day until I had to go to bed. Or if I was on chemo, if I wasn't well, I would go back into my room, because you don't your dignity in that sense. But otherwise, you'd be there all day.
And going back to the point about the food, that's something that helpful to have friends there when you were sitting there with the food in front of you and maybe didn't want to eat it.
Yeah, because it's kind of like forcing yourself to eat. Nothing tastes right. You're not hungry, and your tastes change completely. So you fancy different things. So it's really hard to know what to eat and to bring yourself to eat. But if you're distracted, that's brilliant. Like, you could sit and eat crisps all day if you're talking to someone, and that sounds really bad for you. I know that, but it was calories. So I mean, the nurses and doctors didn't care at that point.
And something that you touch on in your statement about intruding into the detail of conversations, somewhere you could have difficult conversations with friends like Sarah. But
yeah. You're very. I certainly was very conscious that certain things that I might want to talk about would upset my mum and dad. And kind of, like I said, I could detach myself from my feelings. And because of that, I could forget how much it would upset someone else, something that I might say. So, for instance, I was never told the staging initially when I was diagnosed. And my mum and dad didn't really want to know that. That wasn't something they wanted to know, and I completely respected that. But it was something I did want to know, so I was able to kind of have those discussions away without worrying about upsetting my mum and dad, and just things that you're worried about as well. I mean, to be perfectly honest, it's like, it's quite natural to be worried that you might not make it if you're going through all of that, and that is not something you want to say to your parents, because like, that's probably one of the most horrible things you could say to your mum and dad, that you're worried about that. So those kind of things, that it's kind of normal that you could be worried about, that other people were worried about, that provided that space for you, that you could have that discussion, or it at least provided you the space to meet people in order to have discussions. Because if we weren't all in the room, we'd be Snapchatting each other. So it enabled that for you. It gave you a safe space.
now, still on this tour, and I want to find out a wee bit about people again. We're going to come to talk about the doctors and the nurses in a wee while, but we're in the Teenage Cancer Trust common room, and I want to hear something about some of the people that work in there, and there's one person in particular.
Ronan?
Yeah. Tell us about Ronan.
I've got a lot of time for Ronan, a lot of time for him. I mean, a lot of people in the ward become, you're so close with them, you spend all day with them, and you get quite, you hear about their families. They're involved in kind of one of the most traumatic thing about your life. So naturally, you end up building a trust with people, and you know about their lives, and it was nice to see he had a young family and stuff. So you would be hearing about that, but it wasn't just that. He seemed to he took the time to understand people, and whilst we were all sick on that ward and we all had that in common, but that wasn't the only thing about us. That wasn't our whole personalities, and so naturally people are going to clash. Not everyone's going to get on, and that's perfectly all right. But Ronan took the time to understand us, so he would know who would get on, and he would introduce you to people that he would know. Oh, I think they're going to be friends, and he just had a knack for that. He was brilliant at it. But I mean, even if he really didn't want to, he'd just sit and he'd spend time with people and kind of give you a break. And it was really good. It was good fun, and really good fun.
Did he organise activities and things like that?
Yeah, even just like the. Yeah, I mean, it was very rare that we were allowed a Domino's because we all had to have good enough blood counts in order to have a Domino's. But if we could, we'd order us like pizzas in, and we'd all sit together, like something as small as that, just sitting together. Or he would go down to Marks and Spencer's and get like things you fancy, different food, and but kind of aside from that, he organised guitar lessons for me when I was in for a long spell. He knew I told you I thought I taught myself guitar when I was 15. I didn't really. I wasn't very good. But I used to laugh about that with him, and so he went and found a guitar teacher, and he organised that for me. And this teacher used to come in once a couple of times, and I ended up kind of learning some of my favourite songs because of him. So he used to do things like that. He would understand people and then organise things because of that. You weren't just forced into doing something that you wouldn't enjoy. It was always thought about, which was, it was personal. It was nice.
And am I right in understanding his job title broadly was the Teenage Cancer Trust Coordinator? Is that right?
Support coordinator.
I'm sorry, when you go.
Just the support coordinator, yeah.
Right, and was he also funded by the Teenage Cancer Trust then?
Yeah.
So are we right in understanding then that the room, the equipment in it, and Ronan are all there because of charitable donations? Is that right?
Yep.
I mean, more broadly, what you saw at the time, say that fundraising, charitable fundraising, was vital to the services that were provided on the ward.
I mean, otherwise, we all live on that ward. Unfortunately, you're going to be there for long spells of time. Some people are there for like a year. It's horrendous, but because of that, it needs to be a bit more than a hospital room. You need certain facilities in order to make life easier. And so the fundraising that people were doing, a lot of it was ex-patients and their families that would fundraise, but specifically things like the Teenage Cancer Trust, they would, that would make all the difference. That would kind of make it as much of a home away from home as it could be, as comfortable as it could be.
Thinking about some of these other charities then, is there any that spring to mind that you would want to mention?
Yeah, there was obviously there was the Children's Hospital charity. They were on board, but there was the John O'Byrne Foundation now.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
John O'Byrne Foundation. So John O'Byrne himself was in hospital all the time as a child, and he still has his own difficulties. He's disabled himself, but he would spend all day at that hospital, and like he would get things like concert tickets for people, or he would get toys for the kids or laptops and things. And similarly, Les Hoy Foundation did the same thing. that was again, he himself, his daughter had leukemia, so it's a lot of the time it's people with connections like that. But
What's Team Jack? You mentioned Team Jack.
Team Jack.
What's Team Jack?
They provided like snacks. So you used to come in and like it was always the best day when we'd look in the cupboard in the kitchen facilities and it was stocked. So there was crisps and this is quite bad, but I only like salt and vinegar crisps. So it's like we used to all hide our favourite things, but they would provide stuff like that and juices, and for the wee ones there was always like tons of sweets. And I mean, but like I said, the nurses and doctors didn't care what you ate as long as you were eating. So we like tasty things like that they provided, that made all the difference for some kids. And so
Okay, let's move to your bedroom now and think about the rooms in the Teenage Cancer Trust area of the ward. Those rooms would be larger than the other rooms, is that right?
yeah, slightly, yeah.
And what about are there any other differences? Mattresses, for example?
That was our secret. I suppose it's out there now, but we used to have better mattresses. I think it's because at one point there were so many of us that had to stay in bed, so maybe not the best reason why we had them, but they were really comfy mattresses, kind of like padded mattresses and stuff. But we had to have bigger beds as well because you're a lot of people are an adult size as a teenager, so it was, if you're in the other rooms and there wasn't an adult bed available, then you're kind of cramped up. So it made the difference in that sense. It was a lot more comfortable when there was more cupboard space, and you accumulate a lot of stuff when you're in the ward, and so having that extra space was fantastic.
And you used the storage space, is that right? That was quite useful to you?
Yeah, definitely.
Is there anything in particular that you hide away in there?
I had tons of sweets and things, and crisps and
Yeah, so the sweets
snacks.
weren't just for the wee ones, is that?
No, I used to kind of hoard sweets, which was bad. But
And what about the bathroom? We've obviously had quite a lot of evidence about that, and I think we all understand that it's based on a wet room design, is that right?
yeah,
Are there advantages to that?
definitely. I mean, if you're in a chair, for example, if you couldn't actually get up to go to the bathroom, there's a lot of room to maneuver because of that. And there's aids like for the toilets and the shower. There's to help you stand up, and there's a seat and things. So there's a lot of room, and it kind of there's a lot of space that if you needed help in the bathroom or things like that. So it kind of made you lose a lot of your mobility when you're going through treatment. And so it, as much as it can be really embarrassing at first, you need that. You do need those facilities. You need the kind of help with that. So it was really useful to have. And yeah.
Okay. Imagine that I'm not 15, I'm in fact 12, and I've arrived. You're giving me a tour. First thing I want to know, I've seen the Teenage Cancer Trust common room, and I want to know, what is there for me, age 12?
So that was the kind of horrible part, and that used to break our hearts, especially. There was one particular time that we were sitting in the common room, and a boy came in, and I mean he was hooked up to all the strips, and he looked sick. That, like I was saying earlier about your mentality, has a lot to do with it. When you're so deflated like that, you look sicker, and he did, but you could kind of see him starting to perk up, and we just assumed because he came in that what age he was, and so we helped him set up the PlayStation, and he was sitting and he was quite happy. And then one of the nurses had the absolutely horrible job of coming in and having to ask him if he could leave because you can't stay there. if you're not 13. And so even we all watched this boy perk up completely, and you could see his mood lift, and he felt so much better. And then that just kind of dropped, and he had to go back to the room. But you're too old for the playroom. That's for all the wee ones, and there's small children's toys, and so they're confined to you're confined to your room. That was a particular gap in that provision. I'd say about 8 to 12 was the worst of it. Probably about 7 to 12. There was, of course, the play team on the ward. They would try and provide as much as they could, and it just wasn't the same. And there was no way for people of that age to meet anyone as well. And so it must have been so isolating. I can't imagine that.
Now let's up to date a bit on that question. When at some point, hopefully soon, the Cuddihy unit reopens on Ward 2A and the 12-year-old arrives, what facilities will there be for the 12-year-old now?
There will be a common space for the kids that are too old for the playroom and too young for the TCT.
And is that a space, the creation of which has been funded by a charity, is that right?
Yeah, so Sarah and myself, because of that day, we always knew that we wanted to do something to give back. I think that's everyone has that in their heads, that you want to do something, but we wanted to do something big, we just didn't know what. And then that day that boy had to leave, that was horrible, and that stuck out to us. And so we wanted to see what we could do about basically creating TCT, but for that age range. And I think we wanted an excuse to wear fancy dresses, so we decided that a ball was the best way to do this. But we set out and we thought 3,000 is a lot of money to raise. We'd be really lucky if we get that. But then things just started picking up, and we never actually had to advertise the ball. We were so incredibly lucky that just by word of mouth, we completely sold out, and we had 750 people there, and it was an incredible success. And on the night, we raised over £250,000. But today, I believe we're sitting at about 330, which is just, I mean, unbelievable money. I think I love calling it $250,000 because I feel like that makes it sound even better. But people's generosity, when I think because we told them something tangible, something that they could actually see what we were going to do with the money. We had a plan, and we had agreement that if we could fund it, that they would let us do it, and so they would find a space for us. So I think because of that, a lot of people were even more eager to give their money. And I mean, the money that was getting thrown about the room that night, I didn't even know money like that existed. It was incredible. And so the rooms, we found a space now.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you some more about the ball and all of that towards the end of your evidence, but just when you speak about the room that ultimately is going to be used for this, what did that room use?
It used to be a room behind the nurses' station, but if you were a patient in one of those rooms, it was kind of horrible. And the nurses have to be able to talk. They have to communicate. We are a high dependency ward, and the lights need to be on. They are working all night, just as much as they are during the day. And so if you're in those rooms behind the nurses' station, it can be quite noisy. And the only patients they used to be able to put in were like small children that they were keeping a close eye on, because otherwise it just wasn't nice for anyone. And so one of those rooms is now our common room, because there won't be anyone in that overnight. So it's officially now ETYC. So the same as we called our ball Every Thank You Counts. So we kept the ETYC from that for 8 to 12 years.
Okay, so let's go back to 2018 and coming to the end of the tour of the Cuddihy unit. And I'm just going to ask you to sum up what sort of place it is. What would you say?
A happy place, completely. It certainly, before everything went wrong, it sounds bizarre to say, because I know it sounds bizarre to say, because a children's cancer ward does not sound like it would be happy, but children are so resilient. I mean, the teenagers were the mopey ones. We felt sorry for ourselves. But because kids don't understand kind of the gravity of the situation they're in, they used to be running down the ward, hooked up to lines, and their parents would be running after them with the drips, and we used to be in horrors, but they just didn't care. They were having fun, they were playing, and it was a really nice place to be. And the nurses and the other staff, they make it that a happy place. So it's,
I think in your statement you describe it as a wee safe haven.
yeah, oh, completely. It's
A home from home. Okay, that's the very end of the tour, and you reassured me with the description of your safe haven. But I'm a child, I've just had this diagnosis, and I'm scared of the illness and I'm scared of the treatment. So I guess the next thing I would want to know about is a wee bit about the nursing staff and the doctors. Start with the doctors. Your consultant was Dr. Sastry?
Yep, Dr. Jaden Sastry.
Tell us a bit about Dr. Sastry.
If you told me that man could walk on water, I would genuinely believe you. He could tell me the sky is green, I would believe him. He is incredible, and I mean, I literally trusted him with my life. And any opinion he had on what he thought I should do with my treatment, I would listen to him completely. I mean, it sounds quite creepy. I've even got a picture in my wall in my bedroom from the day I rang the bell of myself and one of my friends and Dr. Sastry. He really means a lot to me.
Not just thinking about him, but just the doctors generally and the nurses. Were they good at explaining what was going on?
Yeah, their language was, it was incredible the way they did it from the start. Obviously, it's a horrible situation to be in, and so they don't bombard. So I can say I had a tumour on I was metastatic, so it spread, and it was, malignant. I can use all these horrible words that you would never want to hear, but Dr. Sastry just told me, he said, look, there's a small lump, and it's spread a wee bit. It's also in your lungs and it's in your back, but we're going to treat it and we're going to fix it. And it's very much, it's soft language, and like as you progress through and as you become more comfortable with it, they use the kind of the proper terms for it, and so do the nurses and things. But they don't throw that at you. They don't terrify you or anything. They're very good at understanding you, and they take the time to understand you and how you might like to talk about it, or you don't want to talk about it. Sometimes people just want them to get on with it, and they completely respect that. And I thought it was incredible the way that they used to speak.
I mean, despite them using, as you describe it, soft language, you understand what they were saying to you?
Yeah, I mean, if I wanted them to elaborate, they would have, completely, but it made it, I think, easier to understand. Because if you didn't, no one goes into this with a medical degree. You don't know all these big fancy terms. A lot of people don't know what metastatic means, and so saying things like that would terrify someone if they're thrown words. So just saying it's spread or that and things like that, and not throwing a stage at you either. I think it's easy. They've not broken it down too much that you don't understand the gravity of it, or that you don't understand what you're going through, but they don't bombard you with anything.
So does it follow from what you've just said that from what you saw, what you've heard, that it is possible to be soft in your language, but also be informative?
Yes.
And does it follow also from what you've just said that it was a bit of a two-way street? Were they kind of watching you and listening to you and trying to work out what you wanted to know?
Yes, completely. And sometimes they would just straight up ask me.
I mean, do you think do you think that's the appropriate way to communicate?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think obviously, I mean, a lot of the time, at the very start when they first meet someone, they have to have a single approach, and so with everyone, I think they use this kind of soft language. But as they got to know me and they knew and understood that I like knowing all the information and I like to understand it and it interests me. I, so they used to actually sit and take the time to explain things they didn't need to explain, just like how something in my body works, and then they might explain how it works in a normal person and then explain how it's gone wrong for me. And that's not something that you actually have to go over with someone, but they took that time to understand that that's what I needed, that made me feel safer having all the information. I felt more comfortable if I understood the science, understood why it happened to me, and I didn't feel bad about the fact that I was sick because of that, because I knew and understood it wasn't my fault. And so they were brilliant at assessing me in that situation.
Mm-hmm. I mean, did you get any sense, any point of how they managed with somebody maybe who was less interested in the science, or maybe had less, ability to understand the science or whatever?
Yeah, so a number of my friends, they didn't want anything. They just, I want to know what I need to know and that's it, and just leave it. And so for them, it was still kind of probably soft but informative.
Yeah.
So maybe it picked up a bit that they used kind of the official terms a bit more as they went on through their treatment, but it was never more than they needed to know. It was always just enough to make a decision.
And you also you spoke about them listening to you and picking up on what you wanted. I mean, can you think of any examples of where they were particularly responsive to something that you thought was going on, and maybe they didn't, but they were prepared to indulge you?
So you're not supposed to feel blood clots. That is.
What do you mean not supposed to feel them?
So
you mean to touch under the
you
skin?
shouldn't be aware that you have a blood clot in your body until it's a bit too late, kind of thing, until it's causing a real problem. You shouldn't feel a small blood clot. You certainly shouldn't. I was very aware, and so I took mucositis a lot, which is the lining. Basically, if your whole tract breaks down because it's fast replacing cells, so the chemo attacks that too, and so basically you end up with just ulcers all the way down, and because of that we thought that that's maybe what I was feeling in my throat, but I was adamant that I didn't have an ulcer, and I could tell that they thought I was maybe a bit mental, but they listened to me, that I was positive I could feel something when I was swallowing, and I had an ultrasound, and right enough I had a clot in my neck that had dislodged from my line, and it was tiny, but they did listen to me. And I mean, Dr. Sashi actually came in and said, he apologised. He said, I'm sorry, I never believed that could have been that, but I didn't mind it. I thought I was wrong as well, but even if it seemed that it was really far-fetched, they would listen.
That maybe leads me to just this one final question on this issue to do with communication at this point. Just at a general level, without going into details, at a general level, if the doctors or the nurses didn't know something, would they say that?
Yeah. I mean, they always did. I had a really good relationship with the doctors, especially the junior doctors. I got on really well with them, especially Albert, one of them, and they were always very good at if I asked them a question, or if even with Dr. Sastry or the nurses, I would ask something and they'd say, look, I don't know, I'll find out for you, and they would always come back, and even if it was just coming back to update me, I'm still trying to find out, but we're going to get to the bottom of it. They would do that, and I much preferred that, just being upfront, because then you know where you stand. It's a lot easier to make a decision and to feel more comfortable with where you're at in your treatment if you have all of the facts. And if someone's kind of tiptoeing around things, you might misunderstand. So being upfront like that, I think is really important.
Okay, let's move forward then to start to look at your story and your treatment in particular. Let's start with plans, and be reassured, Molly, I'm not going to walk through paragraphs of your statement, so you don't need to look at it. But as I said earlier, take me to it if you. Let's start with plans. What was the treatment plan at the start?
So for metastatic Ewing sarcoma, you would have 14 cycles of chemotherapy in total.
Did you say 14?
14. And so you would have 6 of 5-day cycles of kind of one set of chemotherapies. And so and this would be in 21-day cycles. So every 21 days I would restart on this chemo cycle, and it would last 5 days, and then I'd have the break in between. And so then at that point we had imagined that I would have my surgery to remove my primary site at my chest wall and reconstruction thereafter. And then I would have the remaining 8 chemos, which was again 21-day cycles, but it was 3 days continuous. And alongside that, for the first 6 weeks of that, I would have radiotherapy, and that would work on my lungs and my spine.
Yeah. Now, what was in terms of looking ahead, when was it anticipated at this stage? So thinking about January 2018, when was it anticipated that you would have the surgery?
I believe this summer.
But was it explained to you by Dr. Sastry and others that although you like plans, the plan has a bit of wriggle room in it, as you put it?
Yeah, you have to allow for wiggle room, because your counts have to recover in between times sufficiently in order for you to restart chemotherapy, because they can't just keep throwing it at you. You have to have a sufficient level of white blood cell count so that you would be able to fight things off. And obviously when you get chemotherapy, it does lower your immunity, and sometimes you hit kind of 0.0, and that's when you're neutropenic, they call it. So whilst you're neutropenic, you can't get chemotherapy. So if you've not recovered sufficiently, then you have to keep waiting until you have. So sometimes the 21 day, it's like 21 plus 2 days, say. And so I knew that there was going to be some I knew that there was going to be some kind of extra days here and there. I was hoping.
Yeah. And I think we can see from your statement, and for those who want the reference, we're around about paragraph 74, that even before you started treatment plan, there was another bit of planning that you had to do. Are you able to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so because of the chemotherapy, I would most likely not be able to have kids, and so there was a way that it was a new thing at the time that I could have gotten, and basically I would have come through to Edinburgh, and I would have had kind of like a section of my ovary taken away, so that in the future, if and when I decided I wanted children, that I could do that, it was, and I could still have my own kids. because obviously it doesn't affect like your womb or anything. It just affects your ovaries. But unfortunately, that was a 3-week long kind of procedure, if you like. I would need a number of things before the actual operation itself. So I think I know I was 15 and that was I mean, it's never something you want to have to make a decision on at that age, but I think you either know or you don't know if you're a kid's parent, if you like kids or not. And I did know I like kids, and so I wanted to give myself the opportunity that if I did. But like I said, I trust Dr. Sastry, and I trusted him from the get-go that whatever he told me, that I would listen to him. And he didn't think I had the 3 weeks. That if I probably wouldn't have had the same outcome treatment-wise had I waited those 3 weeks. So I had to choose to give that up, which is not nice. Giving up a lot, but I mean, you can always adopt. I have to be here to do that. So I think that was kind of the reasoning behind that. But it was a big, scary adult decision to make at 15. I mean, I'd never even sat my exams yet, and I was deciding whether or not I wanted to give myself the opportunity to have kids.
And you mentioned exams, that was the other bit of planning I was going to ask you about. You've got prelims coming up.
Yeah, I was days away from my prelims when I was diagnosed. And so obviously I couldn't go into school. And so I had to postpone them when I would be able to. And I was adamant that I was still sitting my exams in May. Because like I said, I had this plan and I was going to be a doctor. It was not going to deter me. And so in order to do that, I had to get A's. And the only way I would get A's is if I sat those exams. And so I got in contact with school, and they were brilliant. I was very, very lucky with my school that they provided all the work I would need, and I worked through it on the ward. And sometimes teachers would come up and tutor me, and I had a brilliant relationship with like my languages teachers, so they used to come up to the ward and stuff and work with me. So I had to kind of postpone my prelims to sit them around about the same time as my exams.
Okay, well, we'll come on to that. Now let's move through the story of your treatment. The first cycle, January 2018, yep. I think, and there's preparation for that, and I think you had a Hickman line fitted, is that right?
Yes, I did.
And I think you explained to us in your statement that that's different from a central line, is that right?
Yeah.
And you also describe in your statement, you mentioned the process of flushing the line. Tell us a bit about that.
So obviously the blood products go through the line. We have our bloods taken, but also when you're not using the line, blood kind of goes back through it, and it's just natural. So but blood's a very sticky substance, so it can get clogged basically on the line if you don't continue to flush it, and if it gets blocked, then that's another procedure you need, because you can't afford to have a blocked line. You need to have things to be able to go through it, and you also need to be able to aspirate from it. So they had to maintain like every couple of days that you would flush the line in order to avoid that extra procedure of having to have it removed and again.
And was there, when you were at home, how was flushing of the line undertaken?
So the outreach team, there was an outreach nurse assigned to different areas. So my outreach nurse was Anne, and she would come out to the house. If I was ever in school, she would also come to school, but that was very rare that I ever got in. So she would come out and she'd take some bloods and then flush the line. Yeah,
and I mean, you say it's very rare when you're in school. I'm right in understanding that Anne did actually go and visit the school. I think your dad did too.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Just when I was initially diagnosed, because, well, from an infection point of view, just to kind of explain my situation, and then also talk about like how it would work with my classes. But the main priority was about my line, what happens with my line, because I mean it goes into the one of the main veins into your heart, and someone pulls that, then not a very good situation to be in. It's a very dangerous situation, and so they needed to know that you have to effectively pinch it under the skin until the ambulance comes so that you don't bleed out. And that, I mean, that's a horrible thing to say, but people bang into you in the corridor in school, so they had to know what would happen in the worst case scenario, what they would do.
Okay, the treatment itself begins. I think you're discharged after, that would be 5 days, did you say?
Yeah, I went on Tuesday and I got out Saturday.
Yeah. Am I right in understanding from your statement, paragraph 73, that you didn't take all of your anti-sickness drugs?
Yeah.
Why was
So
that?
I probably thought I was better than that. I thought that I would be fine and that I didn't need any extra medications and that I would just get through it. And that's my biggest regret, I'd say, to date. I don't know why I underrated chemotherapy. I think that was just a bizarre decision to make. But I also didn't want. I knew that it could. I don't like not being completely aware of things, and with certain anti-sickness medications, like it can make you it, not sober is probably the best way to describe it. An awful sleepy as well, and I wanted to avoid that as much as possible, and I thought I would be able to manage the sickness because it's but obviously that was a huge mistake. So.
And are we right in also understanding that you began to lose your hair pretty quickly?
Yeah. I was unfortunate. We thought it would be a couple of rounds of chemo before I lost my hair, but I lost it after my first round. Well, I started losing it all in one day effectively, so I just went to my hairdresser and shaved it off.
And is that where the likes of the tea room becomes quite important, starting to notice all of these things? Is that right?
Yeah. It's not a nice thing to lose your hair. I think that was the biggest thing that bothered me is that is wigs, and it still to this day bothers me. And my hair's coming in. I still wear wigs. But when you're on that ward, everyone is in the same boat, and you're actually the odd one out if you have hair, which is bizarre to say. So you're normal. You don't feel sick. Because I hated letting anyone see me without my wig, but I was absolutely fine on that ward. Because everyone was the same. So it helped you come to terms with that.
Yeah. Okay, I think we can see from your statement that you hit zero immunity on day 10. Were you at home by that stage then?
Yeah, so I got out.
And I think that round about the first time you experienced a first temperature spike.
Yeah.
And did that become a pattern for you, that day 10 spike?
Yeah. The very first time it happened, it was just anticipated it was something like a cold, and that's kind of normal, or it was just a reaction to me having chemo for the first time. There's a number of things can cause you for your temperature to raise. Like pain can cause your temperature to raise. So, I mean, I probably didn't help myself not taking anti-sickness to start with. That probably had a big thing to do with it. But from then on out, I didn't seem to get a break from that. After my second chemotherapy I was in, and then it just kept going on. I think there was one time I didn't spike in between chemos.
And are we right in understanding, we've already had quite a bit of evidence from others on this, right in understanding that you were aware that there was a protocol for dealing with temperature, is that right?
Yeah, so if your temperature went above 38.0, then you phone the ward. At that point, they tell you to take paracetamol in order to lower your temperature, allow it to regulate, and they take a note of the time. And if you live more than an hour away, you need to get an ambulance, because it can go downhill very quickly.
Is that to do with sepsis?
Yeah. So if you were to take sepsis, then it's like a golden hour, they call it. Right. And so if you live more than an hour away, you need to take an ambulance at that point.
Now let's move into your second cycle. So February, I think that would be after your 21-day recovery. Now, mucositis, I think is something you've already mentioned this morning. I think we can see from your statement at para 82 that was maybe an issue you began to be more aware of in your second cycle. Is that right?
Yeah. So like after the first cycle, my throat was a bit sore and I had 1 or 2 ulcers, but it was manageable and I could just kind of take throat spray and things, and that was fine. But at the second one, it started off the same way, but then it just got progressively worse, and then I ended up having to be hospitalised for pain management. I mean, it's effectively like 3rd-degree burns on the inside. It's a horrible thing for people, and so pain management's usually, and it's usually a PCA pump for the kids when you get that.
Is that because the chemotherapy attacks the rapidly growing cells?
Yeah, so right? the fast replacing cells in your body. So the kind of that whole lining, your hair, and it can also affect your skin. That's why you're so sensitive to the sun as well. Right. So
I think we can see from your statement again there was a spike at day 10.
Yep.
And then there was an admission. Now, I think on this occasion you were not admitted to Ward 2A. You weren't actively receiving chemo at that point, and you were admitted, I think, to Ward 3A in the Children's Hospital. Would that be right?
Yes, I was. Yeah.
Now, if you're looking at the references in your statement, Molly, it's round about paragraph 84 or so that we're at. I think the reason I mentioned that paragraph is that I think you say that the protocols didn't move with you. They weren't on 3A.
No,
what do you mean by that?
So when you're on Schahalian, because like I said, we can go downhill very quickly. So every 4 hours at the kind of the very least. So it sometimes more often than that, but you would have your temperature taken, your blood pressure taken, and your heart rate and your blood oxygen taken, and that was routine. That happened every 4 hours like clockwork. And it was always really useful. I mean, they were able to pick up really quickly if something was wrong. And they also used kind of more accurate measurements on Schahalian. And that is the Schahalian protocol that's supposed to follow us as patients. That same treatment, we're supposed to get that everywhere, because just because we're off Schahalian doesn't mean how quickly we can deteriorate changes. So, but when I ended up on that ward, that was happening, and when they did come round to check my temperature, it was an in-ear thermometer, and a lot of the in-ear thermometers in the hospital weren't calibrated properly. So whilst it was saying that, and I think it did still say that I spiked, or I was on the verge of spiking, but it wasn't enough to cause concern. But when we actually tested it with a Tempedot, which is what they used in Schahalian, it was above 39, which is really high and quite like a worrying temperature. And so that wasn't following me. And bearing in mind that I was on pain medication, you're supposed to have your heart rate, you're continuously on a heart rate monitor, and if they're not coming in to look at the heart rate and things, that's quite worrying. 'Cause that needs to be measured.
And the mentioned pain control, pain management. Were you on something called a PCA?
Yes. So patient control. So it's basically like a big syringe, and you can have a background going, and it just kind of gives you a kind of a background infusion to tide you over. But you can also, when you need a bolus, press it yourself. And there was a bit of a time lock in between. You couldn't just keep pressing over and over, but it would allow for you to get kind of that just wee boost every so often.
And was that to do with the mucositis?
Yeah.
Yeah. And did you go back onto Cuddihy to enable that to happen? Is that right?
I think it initially, yeah, I was on Cuddihy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think we can see from your statement towards the end of this cycle, so I think we're around about paragraph 88, Molly, if you're wanting to check, that was this one occasion where it took a bit longer for the bloods to recover?
Yeah.
And you were a bit concerned about the deviation from the plan?
Yeah.
And you had a chat with Dr. Sastry about that?
He had to reassure me.
Yeah.
I don't like deviating from plans.
Yeah. Well, mentioned deviating from plans. You recall our Brodie's plan that we have a mid-morning break. Well, we've still got quite a way to go in your evidence. But it's up to you. Do you want to keep going, or do you want a brief break just now?
I'm okay, but I don't mind. I'm quite comfortable.
You're in a good position to judge, Mr. Duncan, and you're in a good position to judge. I'm in a less good position to judge. I'll therefore defer decision making. We had a late start. I'm sure colleagues are prepared to follow your lead.
I think we should proceed. I think Ms. Cuddihy will tell us if she wants a break.
Right. Well, perhaps just proceed.
Thank you, my lord. Let's move to the third cycle of your treatment, Molly, and let's break this down a wee bit. Molly's story to begin with, and I'm going to look at the story of the hospital in a minute. Am I right in thinking third cycle is goes the same way as, or to begin with at least, same way as the second cycle, is that right?
Yeah.
And more mucositis, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Quite early on that time.
Right. And harvesting of stem cells?
Yes. So Dr. Sastry thought that, and I'm at this stage I can say I'm very thankful this happened, but he thought it wise, since my bone marrow wasn't affected and there was no cancer cells present there, that in order to kind of bank my stem cells, that we harvest them, because you can, if you have healthy stem cells, then there's a type of treatment you can get, and this would kind of be a worst case scenario or a last resort kind of thing. But they give you chemotherapy that is so harsh that your blood counts wouldn't recover without a stem cell transplant. But if you were to get your own stem cells back, then you're avoiding the risk of rejecting them because it's your own DNA. So we at this stage began the process of harvesting them just to keep them just in case.
Can I ask how that is done?
Yeah, so you I had injections, basically GCSF, I think, and it basically it encourages the cells to kind of come to the surface of your bone marrow, and it kind of boosts those numbers, and so that it allows for the harvest to be easier. And effectively, it's like a cannula in one arm and a cannula in the other arm, and they take the blood out of one, and it goes into this big machine, and it's basically like a big circle, and it measures the weights. It's really clever, and it filters out the stem cells based on the weight of them. and then it takes them off, and then the rest of your blood comes back in, out, and you get it in the other arm. You're not actually losing any blood, and at any one time there's only about a can of Coke's worth of blood outside of your body, but I mean, it's an incredible process.
And Dr. Sastry explained all of that to you, I take it?
Yeah.
Am I right in thinking also that over this spell you did get to go to school on one occasion at least?
Yeah,
right?
that was the first time I went to school since January.
Okay. Now, that's a kind of snapshot of your story in March. Let's try and maybe think about a different story of the hospital. On the 20th of March, then Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport answered some questions in the Scottish Parliament about the Royal Hospital for Children and the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. Was that something you were aware of at the time?
So, in about the end of February, we were beginning to be aware that there might be some issues with the water, and we weren't to drink it anymore. And certainly in March, that was when there was a day in particular that we were told that you've not to shower with the water, and the toilets were actually all shut off for a number of hours. So it was like, go now, well, your last chance kind of thing. And there was like, a festival, the kind of sinks you can fill up a bottle or wash your hands at that are dotted about the place. They were on the ward, washing hands, because obviously that's imperative that you wash your hands on the ward. But so because of that, we were all very aware that there was issues, and I believe there was a letter because it was mentioned, so it would be in the news, and they had to kind of let us know. But at that stage, I wasn't too concerned with the likes of Parliament and things. That was kind of more my dad took to do with that.
Well, I'm just sort of trying to, what we're going to do is, for a spell at least, is look at your story and look at the story of the hospital. And for a spell at least, we're going to consider them as two separate stories. We've got a bit of your story so far and what you're going on and what you're focused on. Let's look at the hospital now. Now, you've touched on a number of points. One of them, particular water. So we go back to January 2018. If we just think about January to March 2018, begin with, on the ward, were you using water in a normal way?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, even at the start, was there some instruction around use of the showers?
Yeah. So
what
there
was
always it was like a laminated poster up on the wall of the kind of wet room, and it said that to run the shower for 3 minutes every day before use, to clear whatever was in it. So
to what, sorry?
I imagine to clear whatever was in it.
Well, that was going to be my next question. Do you know whether that was to make sure it was at the right temperature, or do you know whether it was to do with the hygiene?
You weren't actually allowed to use water before these 3 minutes. You weren't supposed to.
Right. And I think in your statement you indicate that you saw things starting to change in around about February, and you were using bottled water from then, is that right? You also mentioned in your statement that from time to time the water would actually be turned off in the ward, is that right?
Yeah.
How often did that happen?
2 or 3 times, certainly it happened, but the one standout time was the time where even the toilets were switched off.
That's a little later, is that right, in May?
Yeah, I believe so, but they would get switched off for a couple hours, and we never really knew why. We just knew it was getting switched off. So
yeah. I mean, in terms of going to the toilet when the water was turned off, what did you do? So
all the patients have to, even if you're using the actual toilet, you still have to use bedpans, because they need to keep an eye on the kind of input and output of fluids. So it was okay for patients. It was more the staff and your families that it was a real issue for. I mean, certainly there was one day in particular with one of the doctors, and they came in and they were very, very frustrated, and they came and told us about how they had gone to use the toilet and they didn't know that the water, they hadn't been told the water was getting switched off, and obviously you need to wash your hands, and they had to go to 5 different rooms before they found a sink, and he was horrified that he had moved without washing his hands. And this was all because they didn't know that the water was going to be switched off. There was no warning for medical staff, and that is so crucial to. That's basic hygiene. That's everyone washes their hands. That's not even just a medical staff thing. But
And you said also that you saw these kind of portable sinks or something come onto the ward,
Yeah.
similar to you would see at
I think so,
Transmit or somewhere
yeah.
like that. Yeah, is that
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And did you see water filters on the
yeah,
taps?
on all the taps and in the shower. There was a big kind of bulky filter.
So thinking about what you knew at the time or were aware of at the time in terms of the hospital's situation, I think you said you indicated that you were aware of there being issues in the news. Is that right?
Yeah. So then things started to be put in the news that, I mean, you would find out something was wrong from the news.
Yeah.
And I mean, some of the nursing staff used to get really upset when they got into work in the morning because they'd heard it on the radio coming into work that something was wrong, and they had everyone phoning them what's going on in your ward, and they didn't know.
Was there quite a bit of discussion on the ward?
Yeah.
I mean, I think the way you put it in your statement at one stage, paragraph 165, you say it was all the communication and the discussion around it was all very disjointed.
Yes. It was very lacking in the sense that it's scary to see that there's issues from the news into. I mean, I was getting messages from my friends like, what's going on in your ward? And I was like, what do you mean what's going on in my ward? So I mean, that's supposed to be where you're getting your treatment, and other people are aware that there's issues before you are. I just that was kind of beyond me. But even for the staff, and it started to kind of break down trust between certain patients and staff, because it seemed as if maybe they were keeping things from you, but they genuinely did not know themselves what was going on. And so it was very easy to believe that things were being kept from you, but for the medical staff, a lot of them were in the same position as we were.
Thank you. That's all very helpful. What I was, and it gives us a picture of what your awareness was of the situation. You know, by the time you reach your third cycle in March, and really what I was trying to get a feel for was just how much of those issues were in the background for you, or to what extent actually you were already started to worry about what was going on in the hospital. And is it that you were starting to worry about what was going on even at that stage?
Yes. I don't think I quite realised the severity of what could go wrong with there being issues in the ward, but it did start to get really worrying. That there seemed to be something going on and you didn't quite understand it. But I don't think, as much as I was aware that people could get sick because of it, I don't think that I quite understood how bad that was until I got sick myself.
Yeah, I think you say at paragraph 165, I paraphrase, we knew there was a problem, we just didn't know what it was.
Yeah.
Okay, now we move on then to your fourth cycle, which is April 2018. Now, Molly, I'm going to ask you, do you want to keep going or do you want even a short break just now?
A short break?
Yeah.
Is that okay? Thank you.
Right, I think we're ready to resume. What I didn't say, although again I'm open to any direction from Mr. Duncan, is we'll probably break at about 1 o'clock for lunch.
Thank you, my lord.
Mr. Duncan.
Molly, can we move now to the fourth cycle of your treatment, which is April 2018, and it's round about paragraph 90 statement, if you're following your statement. Now, again, I'm going to just focus on your story rather than hospital story. Did you have another 10-day spike?
Yep.
Remember the date?
usual. Oh,
I said I wasn't going to test you on dates, but
13th
and do you know what day of the week that was? Friday.
Friday. Oh God, no.
You want to describe the 10-day spike that happened on Friday the 13th April?
So I had my temperature spike. When we took my blood tests, my CRP, so that's an infection marker in your blood, and that was particularly high in my blood count.
So sorry to interrupt. I think you said incredibly high in your statement. Is that right?
Yeah.
Sorry.
In the hundreds, which is quite a big deal. You want it in the very low tens at the maximum kind of thing. And so that was obviously quite a big deal, and we didn't know what was going on with that. But I also needed blood, really badly needed blood products. I believe it was blood and platelets, so I would be there all day. But I took an allergic reaction to platelets. So that was the first time I ever had an allergic reaction to blood products, and it was the only time, to be fair. But because of that, I needed kind of an antihistamine injection and things, just to kind of. And from then on out, I had to get cover, what they call cover, whenever I got a blood product. And it's basically they give you the antihistamine before they give you a blood product, because they can't not give you it when your blood counts are so low. And we believe it was just that particular bag that I had a reaction to, but you can't be sure with these things. So it wasn't a good day.
Yeah, I mean, you're in quite a bad way.
Yeah.
And in fact, was this an occasion where you actually had sepsis?
I think that's that one, or it was the next one. Yeah, no, that was the first. So my brother, he had been living abroad in France. So for his degree, it was French and politics. So he had to do a year out, and so he was living in France when I was diagnosed. And because he was working, he couldn't actually get home. This was the first time he was home because it was their Easter holidays, and first time coming up to the hospital with me, and I took sepsis. And so I needed fluid boluses. I call it fluid resuscitation, but it's when you get sepsis, it basically your extremities, they just start to shut down so that they can support your main organs to keep you alive, basically. And so they push fluids in to keep everything circulating and to keep you going. And they can't use your line at that point. So I had the way I took sepsis was I had asked for anti-sickness, and one of the nurses gave me anti-sickness, and my line hadn't been used in a wee while since it had been locked off. And as soon as I got the bolus, I started to feel really poorly, and then I started rigening, which is, I don't know if anyone's talked about rigening previously, but it's the best way I can describe it is like a conscious fit, the way you shake. It's in your temperature's right up, but kind of like my chin was always the first thing to go, and it's like you're cold almost, but effectively everything. And the nurse that actually I have a really good relationship with this particular nurse, and she got very, very upset because she thought it was something in her practice that happened when she's given me the anti-sickness. We obviously know now that it wasn't, and there was an issue with my line. There was an infection, but she was really upset, and they couldn't use this line then. They had to lock it off, so they couldn't use that for the boluses. They had to try and get a cannula in me, but you're like I said, the extremities are kind of like shutting down, so then your veins are going, so it's very, very hard to cannulate you in that position. I was very lucky. I'm hard to cannulate normally, never mind when I'm got septic shock. So it was quite a scary position at that point. I believe it was a bank holiday, and so the nurses were there, and my poor brother, he's home from France for the first time, and he thinks he's visiting me, and he's sitting, and I believe it was 17 syringes he had to open, and it was quickly so they could just keep getting fluid into me through a cannula, because it was the only way, and it's because they were all having to do it. So one of them was trying to cannulate me, the other was trying to push fluids in him, so Dara had to keep opening these syringes for them, and it was I was very conscious that he was seeing me at my sickest so far, and then Ali was very upset as well. Obviously, she was still acting as my nurse, but she thought she'd done something wrong, and that was scary for me. I didn't know what was going on. It was just a frightening situation. I mean, you see sepsis on adverts that it's a like silent killer kind of thing. It's not what you want to hear.
And I think you said at the start of your answer on that there was a clue that there might be an infection here. Is that right?
My CRP.
The CRP, yeah. That's the C-reactive protein.
Yep.
Yeah. Now, are we right in understanding that in addition, you're also reacting to your chemotherapy by this stage, in addition to the other reactions that you've already described, the mucositis and hair loss and the nausea, you're starting to lose skin on the soles of your feet, is that right?
Yeah. It was a reaction to topicide, I believe, one of my chemotherapy drugs. I lost my nails as well. It was quite an odd reaction. That was another thing that Dr. Sastry found bizarre about me in my case, but there just seemed to be so many things going wrong at that stage. Yeah.
I think you also had the beginnings of peripheral neuropathy by this stage, is that right?
So I was starting to need a wheelchair. That was a big point for me. That was when I felt that I lost a lot, because that you look sick. Because I could put on a wig and I could do my makeup and I could go out and see my friends and I looked well, but put me in a wheelchair and I don't look well anymore. So that was, I not only could I, obviously I couldn't feel my feet, well, up to at that point it was kind of up my leg to just under my knee, and then my hands. So I couldn't hold a pen, I couldn't play the piano, which is something I'd done since I was 3. It was it's like constant pins and needles. So then that was more medication I needed to stop that. Rhythm was building at that point.
And I think we can see from your statement that you charged home 20th of April. I think that would be, give or take.
Yeah.
But despite what you've just described, there were other plans going on.
Yeah.
You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so that happened the 13th to the 20th. My first exam was the 30th of that month, and I had yet to sit a prelim. Those prelims that I should have sat back in January. And so because I was starting to take so unwell, including the sepsis and everything else, we thought the best way to look at it was one day at a time. So I would sit a prelim, and then I'd sit an exam, and then I'd sit a prelim, and then an exam. So worst comes to worst, if I sat a prelim the day before and the next day I can't do it, then I've got a prelim as a backup. And I just had to play it by ear that way. So thankfully, because I got out on the 20th, I got to sit my first prelim and exam.
And that was at home?
Yes.
On the 30th of April?
30th of April, Spanish.
Yeah. Sorry, what was that?
Spanish.
Spanish. But the 5th cycle was nearly upon you. I think you were back on the 1st of May to do that. It's paragraph 92, Molly, is where you talk about that.
Yeah. So obviously that then, because all my exams were grouped together, I took a lot of like subjects. So I had 2 languages, 2 sciences, and then maths and English. So subjects that were alike tended to be together in the exam diet. And so all my exams were kind of lumped together. And like I said, I had to sit the prelims, so it wasn't ideal timing. So I needed to be on the ward. But I was very lucky that the hospital and the staff on the ward were all very excited, because I was, I believe, one of the first to ever do this and actually sit the exams. And they had a poster made that they could put up in my room, my hospital room, that's the exam in progress, keep quiet kind of thing. But it was, considering I was so poorly, but I was adamant in my head that I was not poorly, that I wasn't sick, and that I was doing these exams. But in hindsight, I crawled through them, and I have no idea how I did it.
I think in your statement you say it took a lot of anti-sickness medication, is that right?
Oh, I was not sober at all. I have no idea how I understood those questions. It was a lot of medication to get me through it so that I wasn't interrupted with side effects.
How many exams did you do? Can you remember?
10 in total, because I did 5 exams and 5 prelims.
Now, I think in addition to doing exams, you were also having chemotherapy, of course. And you were on Ward 2A for that, obviously.
Yep.
And I think we can see from your statement that you were discharged home and then readmitted, I think, on the 9th of May. Now, I think there were blood cultures taken at that time, is that right?
Yeah. So because I was what we call hovering. So my temperature was always sitting at about 37.9, 38. Like it never went above that, but it never came down. And they were concerned that something was underlying. But they also didn't want to keep me in if they didn't need to. So I was allowed out home, but took blood cultures just to check again to see if there was anything wrong. Because they kept taking them, and usually cultures, I believe it's 48 hours I kept for, because there's a range of bugs they check for, and they were all coming back clean, but CRP was high. I kept spiking, and I was obviously I took sepsis, so they knew something was wrong. We just didn't know what. Yeah,
I mean, I think you were, see from your statement that you were discharged home, I think, on the 16th of May, and I think the way you put it in your statement at one stage is there was a sense that you knew something was coming.
Yeah, completely.
But nobody at this stage knew what it was, is that right?
Yeah, they were quite concerned, and my doctors, because you could, one of the doctors I mentioned before, Albert, he's quite like me. He likes things being organised, and he likes like puzzles things. And so this they couldn't get an answer to this, and they could not understand what was going on. I had all of these symptoms that should tell them that there's an infection there, but there was no infection that they could tell. And I just did not feel right. And I was very good at knowing my own body and knowing when something was wrong. I could always tell. And I just wasn't right. And I admit I've probably put a lot of down to I thought it was stress building up on me. But it just wasn't right.
Now, we know that you come back a little later, maybe for your 6th cycle, and we're going to go to that in a minute. Before I do it, I want to just jump from your story to the story of the hospital again. You've already touched on this earlier. Have a wee look at paragraph 184 of the statement. We don't need it on the screen, Miss Callahan. Just, Molly, if you just have a quick look at it. Now, you told us earlier about an incident where one of the doctors had been frustrated about not being able to get his hands washed. And I just wonder if it's this incident that you're speaking about. Got that?
Yeah. So, the hand washing incident.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it looks like it was maybe in May.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was Dr. Sastry, in fact.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
And that was a thing he was known for in the ward. It was whenever the FY1s came on, and you used to see the more senior junior doctors, they would kind of point out to like make sure you've washed your hands, because Dr. Sastry saw everything and he was very particular about hand washing.
Yeah, you say in your statement in paragraph 184, he watched people like a hawk.
Yeah.
Sure, he washed their hands. Describe that incident to us. Describe how Dr. Sastry behaved and what he said on this occasion.
He is he's such a gentle man. He's one of these people that you feel if you did something wrong for him, he would shout at you, tell you it's disappointed. He's not an angry person at all, but he was so visibly frustrated. And I mean, he's trying to do his job. His job's difficult enough. He's saving children's lives, and he can't wash his hands. They've not even told him that the water's off, that he can't wash his hands. And he knew that my dad was, we as a family in general we were very aware of the issues going on and quite frustrated, and we would speak out about it. And I think because of that, he came and spoke to us about it. To kind of make us aware that they were kind of in the same boat, that they weren't being told anything either. And why would you do anything that would make that job harder? That is beyond me. And it was not a nice thing to see him so. That was the closest to angry I think I'll ever see him. But he was very, very frustrated.
And something else that you touch on in paragraph 184 and that you've just alluded to a moment ago is, the context was Dr. Sastry's standards in relation to hygiene. I mean, we've had quite a bit of evidence over the past few weeks about standards of hygiene on the ward. What was your impression overall? I
mean, I thought that certainly the practices of all the medical staff was exemplary. There was never any issues. I never felt like they would come in, and if they'd gloved up, it was like elbows to use the door, and they'd never touch a door handle after they'd gone to the treatment room, or they'd even get another nurse to come and open the door, and if they had to touch it, if they had to touch something, then they'd go away and they'd rewash their hands and they'd re-glove up, and it was like they would never ever dream of going anywhere near your line if their hands were not gloved up and untouched. And like it was the same when the doctors did their checkups. It was they washed their hands, but it was like right up their arms they would wash, and where they listened to your chest or anything. It was, I thought that it was perfect from that sense. I mean, the cleaning, there was obviously there's issues, and no matter there was some cleaning staff that were very, very particular as well, and you were aware of that. But it, like, no matter how many times that it's the same mops, and there was the floor, even after it's washed, it's still, like, say you spilled something on the floor and you go to wipe it up, the wipe's dirty, and what they're given to clean, I think, was the issue there, the biggest issue, I'd say, with that. But certainly with like hand hygiene and it's exemplary.
Yeah, thank you. Now, let's move back to your story then, and sixth cycle. And I think we can see it's paragraph 95 of the statement, Molly. We can see you're, I think, admitted back on the 22nd of May, and you're discharged the 26th, and you're back in very soon after that on the 31st. And I think the way you put it in your statement at one point is you say you were really not well. Following the discharge home, you're really not well. Now, do you want to walk us through that and describe that to us?
I think that was when I had my last exam, where I was sitting a prelim or something, and my biology teacher, and he actually stopped me in the middle of the prelim and said, "We're not doing this," because I couldn't. He said, "I know you know what you're doing, but you're gonna end up getting a bad mark if you keep doing this. You're not well," kind of thing.
Sorry to interrupt. Was this one that you did at home then?
Yeah, this was one of the ones I got to, a prelim I got to do at home, and
yeah. Sorry, please continue.
I was so tired. Like, getting out of bed was an effort, and I just was really, really, like, I felt awful, and I could, like I said, I knew my body quite well, and I could always tell when I was going to spike, and I knew I was going to spike that day, and I did, and I had to go up to the hospital.
And were you rigering again? So
I got to the car park, and then all of a sudden I just started rigering as soon as I got there. It was really bad. My mum had to take me up in the chair quickly, up to the ward. And I was taken straight into daycare, into one of the private rooms. And I mean, it's a bit bloody to remember that I was really, really bad that time with the sepsis. Really bad. I was not completely aware of what there was maybe 8 or 9 members of staff in there, nurses and doctors, and no one could cannulate me. And I mean, I was all over the bed. I could not stop writhing. And eventually it was Albert that came in, and Albert had worked in neonates, and he managed to get a tiny vein in my hand, so that they could do the fluid resuscitation. But I mean, it was just my dad was away on a business trip at the time, and because we didn't think anything was wrong, we thought that was my break in the cycle and things. And my brother was back in France, and so it was just my mum and I. And I mean, my mum was really upset. I remember that, and I was very frightened at that point. And I think that was kind of one of the first points I thought, like, I kind of fully understood how sick I was and how dangerous it was. But especially when they were panicking that they couldn't get access into me, that was horrible. Because the staff were, as much as they were calm, you could tell that they were they were really struggling because no one could get it, and a number of staff tried until Albert came.
Now, I think shortly after this, you discovered you were given a diagnosis of an infection, is that right?
Yes, Mycobacterium coli.
Now, in a while later today, I'm going to ask you a bit about your reflections on the way that that was communicated with you, and we'll go through the timeline even on that. But let's just go through the detail of what happened, and then we'll move to the reflections later on. So I think we can see from your statement, Molly, it's at paragraph 97, if you want to just reorientate yourself as to where we are. We can see that on the 1st of June 2018, you're told you've got a line infection. And in fact, was this the cultures that had been taken on the 9th of May now coming back?
Yes. So it had taken all that time to grow. And like the incubation period for that particular bug is like between 15 days and I think 8 weeks or something crazy like that. And so that's why it takes so long to grow from cultures. So we were very lucky it was kept.
Yeah. And I think you said a moment ago it was something called Mycobacterium coli.
Yep.
And it's got this tendency to take a long time to develop cultures in relation to, is that right?
Yeah.
And I think you say in your statement that in fact it's got the nickname silent bacteria.
Yeah. Because it takes so long to grow. So effectively what was happening to me and spiking and everything coming back clear, it's you don't know what it is until you're really poorly.
Now, we can see from your statement, paragraph 185, that one of the microbiologists became involved around this time and had a conversation about this situation. I think it was Dr. Inkster, is that right?
Yeah.
Now, was that a conversation with you or with your parents or both?
No. So at the time, that was just with my mum and dad.
Why was that?
I don't know.
What age were you? Do you have any think that might have something to do with it?
I can understand why it would, but up until that point, I had never been the case, and
Yeah.
it was always my decisions.
Had Dr. Sastry ever had any issues about
No,
what he could or couldn't say to you?
no, he spoke directly to me.
Dr. Sastry discussed with you himself, thinking about the beginning of June 2018, did he discuss with you himself what it was that had happened, what the bug was, and all of that kind of stuff?
So he told me about that I had the bug, and we were told it was an environmental bug. So water or air or whatever. We were also told that he hadn't seen it in 25 years or something
Yeah,
like
if you
that.
go, well, if it helps you, go to paragraphs 98 to 99, and everything you've just said is set out there.
Yeah. So yeah, like I said, it was environmental. And the kind of most likely cause of it is water. He had to liaise with a specialist in Edinburgh. It was kind of he knew all about this particular strain and bug, and he would advise them on treatment. So his decision was that it would be 2 months of IV antibiotics, and thereafter it would be oral antibiotics.
If you look, sorry,
sorry.
Molly.
No.
If you look at paragraph 99, just look at the very first sentence. He was very upfront that he didn't know anyone that had it and he'd never dealt with it. Was this one of these occasions where Dr. Sastry it immediately is saying, I don't know what the position is?
Yeah, and it was like, how did I get it? I don't know. And he was apologetic that he didn't know. And
Yeah.
you could tell he was frustrated that he didn't know, but he was always, like I said, very upfront with me, and it was that it's most likely environmental, but that's all I can tell you. And
Yeah.
he had never heard of a case in paediatrics of it.
And that's a point we'll come back to later. But while we're speaking about Dr. Sastry, I would just be interested in your reflections on Dr. Sastry. Ms. Callaghan, I think it might actually be worth having this part of the statement on screen. I think it's page 26 of bundle 6. It's paragraph 100. You got that in front of you now, Molly?
Yeah.
Would you mind actually just reading out what you've said? Just if you just take it nice and slowly.
That was when I saw Dr. Sastry waver a bit. That was when he was starting to be held accountable for that which he was not responsible. Dr. Sastry was responsible for my whole treatment and my overall health, meaning my antibiotics and other medications and procedures. However, I was made sicker by the environment, and therefore he was being held responsible for something that should not have happened, and he had to come up with treatment plans for things other than my cancer. He had to start balancing what was more important. Was it treating me for this bug and not giving me my chemotherapy, which in turn could cause the cancer to take hold? Or would it be giving me my chemotherapy, bringing my immune system down, and making the bug take hold? It was scary enough without having to see the staff not knowing what to do. It's an impossible decision, and it's something that no one should ever have to decide. It was a balancing act, and it wasn't fair for Dr. Sastry.
Okay, we can put that to one side now. Thank you, Callaghan. It wasn't fair to Dr. Sastry. Was it fair to you?
No, I don't think it was fair to me, but yeah, I suppose
Well, I mean,
it. Obviously, it was. I mean, it was horrible to not have a plan, to not know that something's certain, and things are uncertain enough with my diagnosis. It was not the nicest prognosis to start with, and so throwing this on top of things, it was yet another unknown. It was horrible. I think it's the best way to describe it. But
but
with Dr. Sastry, like I said, I trust him implicitly, and he ended up. I'm here, and obviously his decision was great, but that kind of balancing act when you're responsible for someone's life, I can't imagine that. Like, if I'm lucky enough that I get to be a doctor, and it's hard enough when you have to make tough decisions like that, but to throw in things that you shouldn't even have to consider, like the environment, it is unfair.
now the plans were changing. But
Yeah.
Dr. Sastry did come up with a plan. And in terms of the plan going forward then, what was Dr. Sastry's plan?
So firstly, the decision to have missed surgery to remove my primary site, that was postponed. Was that couldn't happen. I couldn't undergo something as big as that with that on board. And so my treatment plan for the cancer had to be rearranged. So we made the decision that I would then commence the 8 chemotherapies, the kind of the session of 8 next with the radiotherapy, and I would hopefully have my surgery before the last 2 chemotherapies. But before any of that happened, we had to get a hold of the bug. So I started an IV antibiotics all day, every day, and it was just a constant rotation of antibiotics. And it was antibiotics that the nurses had never heard of. Like, one of the nurses in particular used to laugh trying to pronounce it. It was like they'd never used them, and there were horrible side effects. I mean, I thought the chemo side effects were bad, but this actually, the amount of medication I was on because of the antibiotics, I ended up with a prolonged QT interval with my heart. So basically, when my heart would fill up and it would pump out the blood, it wouldn't fill back up fast enough. So I would collapse. Then I was on bed rest and couldn't go to DCT. I couldn't leave my room. I mean, I couldn't even get up to go to the toilet. It was, you lose your dignity enough in there, never mind with that. And then I was very, very ill. I was very sick all the time. It was my whole mood changed. That things started to kind of affect me then, and I was off school now. So I'd finished my exams. I didn't even have that other focus. So I was just kind of there. Just not a nice existence.
Let's just go through some of the detail of that again, Molly. So, am I right in understanding that you were an inpatient for the whole of June 2018? Is that right?
Yeah. So instead of the 2 months IV, they decided to just do one.
And your Hickman line was removed in the meantime. Is that right?
Yeah, on the 1st of June.
And again, you're back on PCA.
Yep.
Yeah. And was that to do with the line removal, or to do with treatment, or what was that to do with?
I believe that was the mucositis as well.
Right. And then, as you say, the antibiotic treatment, such as the new and unused nature of these antibiotics that nobody can actually pronounce their names.
Yeah.
How were they administered?
So I had to get cannulas, and like I said earlier, I'm really difficult to cannulate, and they kept tissuing. So that's basically when the cannula comes out of the vein it's supposed to go into, and whatever's going into the cannula starts going into the surrounding tissue, and it swells, and it's painful.
Yeah.
You can't use that cannula anymore because of that.
So the antibiotics would start just pouring into the surrounding tissue, is that right?
Yeah.
And I mean, in your statement, say that the antibiotics were sometimes described as being like bleach.
Yeah. It was like, it was basically just to clear everything out. Because they didn't know what was going to work for this bug. They could only hope. So it was really, they were a strong combination. I mean, you know yourself, you're on antibiotics for 3 days and you feel rubbish. That was all day, every day for a month, and it was heavy duty antibiotics.
How, on any given day, how long were you hooked up to antibiotics?
All day. Like I was never, so sometimes I might get a break, but I was still hooked up to machines because I was on the PCA, and then I needed anti-sickness because of the antibiotics and because of the PCA, and then I needed fluids because I couldn't drink anything because my throat was in such bad way with the mucositis, and then I was put on TPN, which is like, it's basically they measure your blood to see what you're lacking, vitamins and minerals wise, and it's like that's their way of giving you the nutrients you need when you can't eat. Because I didn't have the tube, so I was never off of machines.
But you still didn't have a feeding tube at this point.
No.
Now, other problems from the antibiotic treatment that you mentioned start collapsing.
Yep.
And that was investigated, and there was an issue with the heart that you've just described, resulting in you being confined to bed.
Yep.
And as you say, the loss of dignity that goes along with that, is that right?
Yeah.
Were you discharged home before July, or were you still there in July?
I got home for the start of July.
You turned 16 in July, is that
Yeah,
right?
I did. Yeah.
But then I think you would be back soon after that to recommence chemo, is that right?
Yeah, so I recommenced chemo while I was in on the antibiotics. Eventually I got a line back in because we were having so many issues with these cannulas, and I needed to get chemo. The chemo I was on was too strong to go through a vein. They needed a line. And like I said, it was that balancing act. We needed to start the chemo again once we'd given a few weeks of the antibiotics to work. So I got Hickman line back in, and that's my cycle started. The first of the 8 was started while I was in, and then I got the second after I had come out. I had to come back in again.
Well, we're now about to move into the stage of, or the next stage of treatment under the new plan. And I wonder, my lord, if that's something we should maybe embark on this afternoon.
Yes, that would seem to be right. Ms. Cuddihy, we'll take our lunch break now, so it's 1 o'clock. Well, if you could be back for 2, that would be good. Right, we'll rise and sit again at 2 o'clock.